a Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart.
And I'm Gary Bain.
And together we're Pete and Gary's Military History
Podcast.
Hi, it's great to be with you. We love being with you. And today I'm Peter Hart and I'm with Gary Bain. Gary, what are we doing today?
Who are you normally with then?
I'm with anybody but you normally.
All right, okay. Well, today, Pete, we're going to do Siegfried Sassoon, the soldier, as opposed to the hairdresser.
Oh, so, yes. Balance more about his military career than about his poetry. But we've
got some of his poetry, some of it...
a soup song.
Yeah, some people may well have heard of. Some
so who
they may
is
not
he?
have
Come
done.
on, if he's not a hairdresser...
Well, he was an English poet, an English war poet, although he did start writing poetry before the war. He was a prose writer and a very brave soldier.
Ooh.
Now, his poetry often described the horrors of the trenches and satirised the uncaring nature of authority figures and uncaring civilians. Now, he eventually cracked and he
the pressures
protested.
of the war,
yeah,
sort of.
they got to him and he protested in his titled "Finished with the War: A Soldier's Declaration of 1917," which culminated in his admission to a military psychiatric hospital and his famous friendship with Wilfred Owen.
Ah, so I'm looking forward to this. So, when was he born?
He was born on 8 September 1886 in Matfield, which is near Tunbridge Wells in Kent.
Oh, look, you told me that.
His father, Alfred Sassoon, was Jewish, but he'd married outside the faith to an Anglo-Catholic called Teresa Thornycroft. So he was disinherited by his wealthy merchant family. Now, even though
did that leave them poverty?
No, even though he was disinherited, they were still very well off. You would describe them as upper middle class, Pete. They were living in a fairly big house, Wearley, in Matfield. Now, his name...
Come to think of it, I've seen that. It is a big house. It's, big compared to yours. And yours is a palatial mansion.
He lived in a house, a very big house
in the country.
Yes. Now, his name... It's an unusual name, Siegfried. It came apparently from his mother's poor taste in Wagnerian operas.
Yeah, she must have really had bad taste. Nothing worse than a Wagnerian opera. Anyway, so any brothers and sisters?
He was the second of three sons, although when he was 4, his parents separated acrimoniously. And indeed, when Alfred Sassoon visited, their mother used to hide herself away.
Sorry.
Janet does something fairly similar when you visit.
Yeah, I know. She's not around, is she? She's not around, is she? But there's a quote from Sassoon. It's quite a sad little quote, isn't it, for anyone who lost a parent rather earlier than they should have done. I wanted to enjoy my parents simultaneously, not alternatively. I thought that's sort of funny and quite sad.
It is, and my own circumstances. My own mother left when I was 4 years old, so yeah. I can equate to that.
So just as you were becoming sentient, she buggered off.
I've never been sentient.
Now, so what happened?
Sadly, his father died in 1895 of tuberculosis. So 1895, he was about 9 years old, wasn't he? Yeah, so very young. But from the age of 15, Sassoon was educated at Marlborough College in Wiltshire. He did well at cricket. But he had a series of illnesses that sort of hampered his academic achievements. He then studied first law and then history at Clare College, Cambridge University, from 1905 to 1907.
Now, he ran into a problem there, which was not related to illness, was it? It was related to being bone idle and more interested in poetry than the subjects he was meant to be doing.
Yeah, he didn't put in the required effort, I think, is how we would describe it nowadays. And so he gave up and left without a degree.
So we've got to remember, this is a privileged young man. He can leave. He doesn't have to work. He's just living at Wearley back in Kent and doing bugger all except...
Well, he spent the next few years hunting foxes, playing cricket and writing self-published poetry.
He must have been popular with the local. So he has a success, doesn't he, early on with a thing called the Daffodil Murderer. That's 1913. Which this is clearly we wouldn't have known this, but for looking it up, it was a parody of John Masefield. I don't know what that is when it's at home. I know he was a dreadful First World War author. And it features a Sussex farmhand ruin an accidental manslaughter charge he got after a fight in the local pub. That sort of thing that used to happen to you and your chums in the army, wasn't it?
No.
Oh.
We were never charged with manslaughter. It was usually murder.
Of course, yeah. So he's living there. He's got an adequate private income, about £400 a year, which is a
lot of money at the time.
That is a lot of money. I mean, he does become richer, doesn't he, though? What happens to him?
Well, much later in life, he has a rich auntie who leaves him enough to buy Hatesbury House in Wiltshire.
Oh.
What's the matter, Pete?
Well, I want a rich auntie. Why can't I have a rich... My auntie's dying, I'll get nothing.
Well, I often think of you as my rich auntie because I'm going to get a few quid when you go.
Yeah, probably.
But at least 50.
So he's growing up. He's conflicted in his well, I'm not sure he's conflicted in his sexuality, but he's neither here nor there at the time. He's a sort of mostly homosexual, muddled bisexual. I'm not sure he ever really resolved what he was. It's not our business, is it, Gary, really? We're not going to...
No.
This isn't what this is about. There's lots of stuff about this on the... in books and the internet. Was he a deep political thinker? Well, I've got another quote from him which shows the depth of his thought on world affairs. I think you'll be impressed by this, Gary, because it's much akin to your own liberal views. France was a lady. Russia was a bear, and performing in the county cricket team was much more important than either of them.
What's cricket?
It's that game that's not football they play in the summer.
Oh.
He tried to play cricket. He was a good bowler, not bad batsman, enthusiastic, good connections, lots of private tuition because he's rich, but he wasn't quite good enough in the end. He played cricket for Matfield Village, played cricket for a lot of teams. And the first time I was ever really away, you're going to be fascinated by the next bit. It's about cricket, Gary.
I am.
You're hanging on my every word. I could see.
I am falling asleep as we talk.
Why are you drinking coffee then?
Because I'm falling asleep as we talk.
Oh, to keep away. Anyway, he wrote a brilliant chapter in one of his books after the war called The Flower Show Match, which is just brilliant. You ought to read it. You might like cricket. And it describes his fictional alter ego, George Sherston. It's from George Sherston's Progress. In a match between Matfield and Brentford. And I played in a recreation of this when I played for the Imperial War Museum team. Again, in the recreation, it was in the 1990s sometime, and they actually had the green it was played on and everything. I was dead impressed. There was a crowd, and there was a brass band, and there was a commentary from a bloke through a loudspeaker. And I was, on the other side, there was Dennis Silk, who you will remember well, of course, with your love of cricket, was... He captained Somerset, and he was in test teams, not non-test English teams. Yeah, and... I thought he was about 150 million years old. He seemed that I couldn't believe he was still walking, never mind playing cricket. He was about he was mid-60s, I expect. But I had to bowl at him, and he kept smashing my slow military medium in-swingers to all parts of the ground. And the commentator would say, "And he's hit another one for 4. Well, that bowler must be embarrassed at bowling such tosh." It was this bowler went... But I now look back on that and think...
Did you bowl underarm?
No, I might as well have done. But he was in his mid-60s then.
Prime of life, Pete.
Prime of life.
Prime of life.
Prime of life. That's it. Now, war comes. What does he do when war comes?
Well, Sassoon joins C Squadron of the first... Sussex Yeomanry.
The
Sussex Yeomanry as a trooper. And he does that on the 4th of August 1914.
That day.
The day Britain declared war on Germany. So
why?
Well, he seems to have felt it was his duty to his country and to his neighbours. And initially, they were billeted at Hode Farm near Canterbury. I think I've seen that, actually.
That's near your holiday mansion, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I've seen it.
And this is a quote from him. And are we to that? There's something... Here's what he says. Only one gent in the ranks, young Hope, son of J.E. Hope. The dullest man in Parliament, isn't he? And his son takes after his papa. The Colonel asked me to be an officer, but I don't feel equal to the effort, although it would be a more satisfactory existence. There's something almost idyllic about those early weeks of the war. The flavour and significance of life were around me in the homely smells of the thriving farm where we were quartered. My own abounding health responded zestfully to the outdoor world. So a sort of halcyon days. Halcyon.
Now, in October 1914, he fell off his horse and he broke his arm badly. Now, this is quite unusual because, as we mentioned earlier, he was a fox hunter. He was a good horseman. He was
breaking in new horses, and something went wrong.
Now, he spent some months recovering back at Wearley. He had spent a life having his every need catered for by servants and grooms.
You have your every need catered to by Janet.
Well, as do you by Polly, I understand.
Yeah.
But as a trooper, he was at the beck and call of every officer and NCO. So menial tasks were absolutely a new thing to him.
Yeah, and I suppose he got more and more tempted, because he can get a commission at any time with his background, and he got more and more tempted. Does he give in?
Yeah, he gives in, and he accepts a commission with the 3rd Special Reserve of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers.
So in April 1915, he reports a training depot at Litherland. That's just north of Liverpool. The home of the greatest.
I've never heard of it.
The home of the greatest football club in the world.
I've never heard of it. Liverpool, I mean. I've heard of Litherland. Litherland FC.
And he goes through the normal training for a second lieutenant, and he doesn't shine. He adopts what I understand you military folks would call a grey man tactic. Now, you might like to explain what's a grey man tactic.
Well, just not be obvious for anything. Just melt into the background. Don't stand out, but don't be bad. So middle of the road, I suppose you would describe it. Just get on with it. Get the job done.
Not drawing attention to yourself.
Don't draw attention.
Now, he spends a lot of his time playing golf. This is what
playing golf?
But this is what it took. You spend a lot of your time playing golf.
I didn't in the army.
No, you wouldn't have been allowed, would you?
No.
And I mean, the lads didn't spend their time playing golf. This is the difference about being an officer, of course. This is why he'd given way to temptation. The people who are training him, how does he feel about them? The dugout training officers, the dugout NCOs, the older people. What does he think about them?
Well, he doesn't think that they've got any real knowledge of the reality of modern warfare.
Now, he thinks that later on, but at the start, does he really know what it's like himself?
No, he doesn't. And later in his poetry, there's a powerful theme that develops about that, and he reflects that in some of his war poetry.
We'll come back to that. Now, he makes a couple of mates there. Well, one in particular. Sorry, let's just concentrate on one, and that's another trainee officer. That's Second Lieutenant David Thomas. Now, who is he in the George Shurston trilogy?
Well, he's the Dick Tiltwood in the George Shurston trilogy. Now, both of those were sent to Pembroke College, Cambridge, to complete their training.
Right, more officer training.
So they stay together.
Now, I think at this point, as we mentioned, later on he'd look back and pin up, and he doesn't like dugout officers and things, but at the time he has somewhat naive and sentimental belief in the war. And you're reading the poems because of your, you're just...
Wonderful voice.
And your cultured nature.
Yes.
So you're going to read a poem called Absolution, and this is naive in the extreme, and it shows a different thing to what we're used to from Sassoon later in the war.
I used to have to clean the Absolutions when I was in the army.
Yeah, with your toothbrush.
Yes. The anguish of the earth absolves our eyes, till beauty shines in all that we can see. War is our scourge, yet war has made us wise, and fighting for our freedom we are free. Horror of wounds and anger at the foe, and loss of things desired, all these must pass. We are the happy legion, for we know time's but a golden wind that shakes the grass.
Now that's pretty idealistic, and all things must pass. George Harrison put it, but it's all pretty naive. And the first blow comes quite early because his brother his brother. What happens to him? Second Lieutenant Hamo, H-A-M-O.
Hamo, unusual name.
He's serving with the Royal Engineers, and he's badly wounded. What happens to him?
Well, he's badly wounded in the leg, shattering the bone on the 28th of October during wiring operation in no man's land at Suvla Bay.
Gallipoli.
Now, rather than expose his men to sniper fire coming out to rescue him, he crawled back, falling over the parapet into the trench.
That can't have done him any good.
No, it probably exacerbates his wounds. And he died on the hospital ship Kildonan Castle on the 1st of November. He's actually commemorated on the Hellas Memorial.
I'll tell you what, we'll have a look for him, because it'll be pretty easy to find.
I would have thought so.
On the Royal Engineers, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
So that's a blow to Sassoon. On 17th of November, he's sent out with David Thomas to join C Company, 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers on the Western Front at La Hamel. That's near Batoon, as you know, and he gets there on 25th of November. Now, he becomes close friends with another young officer then serving with the 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and we've encountered him before in a couple of podcasts, and it's the legendary figure of Lieutenant Robert Graves. We've got a quote that you're going to read from Robert Graves, which describes his first meeting with Sassoon. Let rip, Robert.
I went to visit C Company Mess, where I got a friendly welcome. I noticed the essays of Lionel Johnson lying on the table. It was the first book I'd seen in France that was neither a military textbook nor a rubbishy novel. I stole a look at the flyleaf, and the name was Siegfried Sassoon. Then I looked around to see who could possibly be called Siegfried Sassoon and bring a copy of Lionel Johnson with him to the 1st Battalion. The answer being obvious, I got into conversation with him, and a few minutes later we set out for Bethune, being off duty until dusk, and talked about poetry.
Yeah, and that's the essence of that. They become really close friends and exchanging. And Robert Graves sort of guides Sassoon quite a bit in a different attitude. Now, in Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, that's part of the George Sherson trilogy, Sassoon calls Graves David Cromlech. And this is his quote. He says, "At his best, I'd always found him an ideal companion, although his opinions were often disconcerting. But no one was worse than he was at hitting it off with officers who distrusted cleverness and disliked unreserved utterances. In fact, he was a positive expert at putting people's back up unintentionally. The colonel was heard to remark that young Cromlech threw his tongue a hell of a lot too much. He wasn't good at being seen but not heard." Not a grey man, eh?
No, not a grey man. Now, Graves seems to have quickly influenced Sassoon towards a much more gritty realism in his poetic outpourings. And you've got a quote from Sassoon here.
"My inner life is far more real than the hideous realism of this land of the war zone. I never thought to find such peace. If it were not for mother and friends, I would pray for a speedy death. I want a genuine taste of the horrors, and then peace. I don't want to go back to the old inane life, which always seemed like a prison. I want freedom, not comfort. I've seen beauty in life, in men and in things, but I can never be a great poet or a great lover. The last 15 months have unsealed my eyes."
Now, Sassoon was made platoon officer at the line while the unit was on rest. And he's then appointed transport officer, so was not initially in the front line for several months.
Now, the tone of his writing does start to change. What do you think the influence of that is? It's not, if he's out the line, it can't be his own experience. Who's guided him, do you think?
Well, it's got to be Graves, hasn't it?
And what's he going from?
Well, he's going from a sort of dilettantish sentimentality to a discordant new brutalism, which it's designed to smash home the nature of trench warfare to civilians back home.
Now, two things are sort of guiding it as well. One is the death of his brother Hamo, but also his chum David Thomas, who was really close to him. And Robert Graves is a witness to what happens on the night of the 18th of March 1916. Graves is in the trenches with A Company, and what does he say?
"About 10:30, rifle fire broke out on the right, and the sentries passed along the news. 'Officer hit!' Richardson hurried away to investigate. He came back to say, "It's young Thomas, a bullet through the neck, but I think he's all right. It can't have hit his spine or an artery, because he's walking to the dressing station." Then news came that David was dead. The regimental doctor, a throat specialist in civil life, had told him, "You'll be all right, only don't raise your head for a bit." David then took a letter from his pocket, gave it to an orderly and said, "Post this." The doctor could see that he was choking and tried tracheotomy, but too late.
What had happened is, in trying to get this letter, he'd sort of gone like that, leaned forward, and of course raised his head, and that was meant to be. Now, the fact that this was a letter to his girlfriend, I suppose that might have had some sort of resonance with Siegfried Sassoon as well, in one sense. But he seems to be driven almost mad with grief, doesn't he? He reacts badly, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he gets filled with thoughts of vengeance, and he becomes an almost suicidally brave young officer. He's christened Mad Jack by the men, so that should tell you something.
Why? Why? What's he doing then?
Well, at night he undertakes a series of voluntary patrols, and he's accompanied only by a couple of men, excuse me, creeping out into no man's land, armed with a knobkerrie and a revolver. Now, knobkerrie's like a club, big knot on the end of a lump of wood, and hurling grenades. Now, that's using his cricket bowling skills. Whenever he heard the Germans. Now, if you were using your cricket bowling skills, they'd hit it straight back at you.
They would, yes. Right, thank you for that. I wonder if that was pre-planned. Right, now this is what Siegfried Sassoon says. "No man's land fascinates me, with its jumble of wire tangles and snaky seams in the earth winding along the landscape. The mine craters are rather fearsome, with snipers hidden away on the lips and pools of dead-looking water. I'm not going out for nothing tonight. I know I ought to be careful of myself, but something drives me on to look for trouble. Greaves tried to stop me going out last night, but that was child's play. Only 2 or 3 sniper shots at us, and the white rocket lights going up while we lay flat and listened to our bumping hearts and laughed with sheer delight when the danger was over."
Now, he's filled with a visceral hatred for the Germans who killed his friend, and he goes on to say,
"I used to say I couldn't kill anyone in this war, but since they killed Tommy, I would gladly stick a bayonet into a German by daylight. Someone told me a year ago that love and sorrow and hate were things I'd never known, things that every poet should know. Now I've known love for Bobby and Tommy, and grief for Hamo and Tommy, and hate has come also, and the lust to kill." And on the 2nd of April 1916, he writes a new poem, and you're going to read this one's called Peace.
"In my heart there's cruel war that must be waged, in darkness vile, with moans and bleeding bodies maimed. A gnawing hunger drives me wild to be assuaged, and bitter lust chuckles within me unashamed." Now,
that's not a golden wind that shakes the grass. This is...
Well, there's also not much peace in it, is there?
No, his feelings are really chaotic. This is something else he wrote. "I'm living in a morose hunger for the next time I can get over the wire and look for Germans with a bludgeon. Stockwell wants a prisoner, and I'm going to get one. But it isn't for that I'm going out. I want to smash someone's skull. I want to have a scrap and get out of the war for a bit or forever. If I get shot, it will be rotten for some people at home, but I'm bound to get it in the neck sometime. So why not make a creditable show and let people see that poets can fight as well as anybody else, and death is the best adventure of all." Now, do you get the resonance there to Peter Pan?
Yeah.
Death be an awfully big adventure. He's all over the place, isn't he? Anyway, what happens next?
Well, on the 25th of May 1916 at Morlancourt, a 28-man raiding party led by Lieutenant Stansfield was held up on the German barbed wire. Now, Sassoon had been assigned duties back in the British front line when a messenger came back to tell him that the raiders were unable to get through the barbed wire.
Now, this is a long quote, but it's quite powerful. And Sassoon says this: "O'Brien says it's a failure. They're all going to throw a bomb and retire. A minute or two later, a rifle shot rings out, and almost simultaneously several bombs are thrown by both sides. A bomb explodes right in the water at the bottom of the left crater close to our men, and showers a pale spume of water. There are blinding flashes and explosions, rifle shots, a scurry of feet, curses and groans, and stumbling figures loom up from below and scramble awkwardly over the parapet, some wounded, black faces and whites of eyes and lips show in the dusk. When I've counted 16 in, I go forward to see how things are going and find Stansfield wounded and leave him there with 2 men who soon get him in. Other wounded men crawl in. I find one hit in the leg. He says, "O'Brien is somewhere down the crater badly wounded." They're still throwing bombs and firing at us. The sinister sound of clicking bolts seems to be very near. Perhaps they have crawled out of their trench and are firing from behind their advanced wire. Bullets hit the water in the craters, and little showers of earth patter down on the crater. 5 or 6 of them firing into a crater at a few yards range. The bloody sods are firing down at me at point-blank range. I really wondered whether my number was up. From our trenches and in front of them, I can hear the mumble of voices. Most of them must be in by now. After minutes, like hours, with great difficulty, I get round the bottom of the crater and back towards our trench. At last I find O'Brien down a very deep, about 25 feet, and precipitous crater. He's moaning, and his right arm is either broken or almost shot off. He's also hit in the right leg, body and head also, but I couldn't see that then. Another man is with him. He's hit in the right arm. I leave them there and get back to our trench for help. Shortly afterwards, Lance Corporal Stubbs is brought in. He has had his foot blown off. I get a rope and 2 more men, and we go back to O'Brien, who is unconscious now. With great difficulty, we get him halfway up the face of the crater. It's now after 1 o'clock and the sky beginning to get lighter. I make one more journey to our trench for another strong man and to see to a stretcher being ready. We get him in, that's O'Brien, and it's found that he has died, as I had feared. Wow, and that's quite a... He's going backwards and forwards across no man's land, under fire. Mad Jack.
You did very well to read that, so I think I'll do the next quote by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Stockwell.
Oh, well, is this another long one?
He says, "It was largely owing to Sassoon's bravery that it has not been a complete disaster."
Yes, well, thank you.
That's all right.
And Sassoon, as I say, he's called Mad Jack. And this is another quote from him. He says, "They say I'm trying to kill myself. Am I? I don't know." Again, he's all over the place, isn't he? And a couple of months later, he's awarded the Military Cross for this action. And the citation, you're going to read the citation, aren't you?
"For conspicuous gallantry during a raid on the enemy's trenches, he remained for 1.5 hours under rifle and bomb fire, collecting and bringing in our wounded. Owing to his courage and determination, all the killed and wounded were brought in." Now that's quite something.
That is quite something. And Mad Jack, this is a brave, if not heroic, young officer.
Now, on the 4th of July, the 1st Royal Welsh Fusiliers took part in the attack on Mametz Wood, and Sassoon was in a reserve company. But he moved forwards and then pushed on alone, trying to get a German sniper and attacking a German trench. And you've got another quote, Pete.
Yeah, Mad Jack again. "I went across from our bombing post to where Wood Trench ended, as there was a Bosch sniper. The others tried at the parapet, so they didn't... The others... They're at the parapet. Sorry, I misread that. So they didn't see me coming. When I got there, I chucked 4 Mills bombs into their trench, and to my surprise, 50 or 60 ran away like hell into Mametz Wood." That's quite something. And
now the idea he then sat down and began reading a book of poems is surely...
It's not mentioned in any of his sources.
Yeah, it's apocryphal, isn't it? And he was later recommended for the MC or even the DSO, but he received neither. Yeah. But then there's more bad news on the 19th of July. Robert Graves was badly wounded, and indeed he was initially reported as dead, and Sassoon was once again asking...
Well, this is a quote from him. He says, "Won't they leave anyone we're fond of?" Quite sad, really, but there's good news coming. We'll come back to that. In late July, he gets... Is
that the good news?
Yeah.
Late July he gets dysentery.
The most poetic of diseases, as you recall from
Yes.
that. Do you remember that time in Gallipoli when you had Bain's disease?
Yes, I do. But he doesn't only get that. He gets the full gambit, doesn't he? He gets
Trench fever. Oh, and a respiratory infection. They've been going around a bit recently, haven't they?
Yeah, and on the 2nd of August, he's evacuated for a lengthy convalescence back in the UK.
Now, what is the good news?
Well, he's delighted to find that Graves was not occupying one. Now,
What a great pun!
that is a pun, Pete, and I can't take all the credit for that.
No. Let's move on.
That is your pun,
I think it's brilliant pun.
and I had to ask you what it was because I didn't get it.
Nor did I when I read the notes. Right, so Sassoon. So good news is that Graves is still alive. That cheers him up a bit. Now Sassoon's busy himself. He's preparing for the publication, a proper publication, not self-published. Although that's no disrespect to self-published books. What's it called?
Well, it's Old Huntsman and Other Poems, and it comes out to a really good reception in 1917.
Now, what's happening to his poetic instincts? This is a theme, isn't it? We've talked about it before. What's he drifting towards?
Well, he's getting increasingly more anti-war sentiments, and these are being encouraged by his growing friendship with a group of pacifists.
Who are they?
Well, it included Lady Ottoline Morell and Bertrand Russell. Oh, I've heard of him.
Yeah, I've heard of her. She's a real character. She used to wear lots of makeup and dramatic clothes.
Who did Bertrand Russell?
No, well, that's another subset of rumours. No, Lady Ottoline Morell. She was about 6 foot tall, and it's one of the most enjoyable things about reading his diaries and his other correspondence is that she clearly terrifies Sassoon. And it's and she takes a fancy to him, and it's what they call a doomed romance.
I wonder why. Now, he's declared fit for service and he returns to Litherland Training Depot in December 1916. And it's whilst there he wrote a really powerful piece.
You're going to read this. This is called Blighters.
The house is crammed, tier beyond tier they grin and cackle at the show, while prancing ranks of harlots shrill the chorus drunk with din. We're sure the Kaiser loves the dear old tanks. I'd like to see a tank come down the stalls, lurching to ragtime tunes or Home Sweet Home, and there'd be no more jokes in music halls to mock the riddled corpses round Baypalm.
Wow. So, and now, I mean, that's about music halls. I think you mentioned off tape that there's a reference to that, possibly the House of Commons in there. Music halls. It's a clever, it's a good poem. Now, he's posted back to France in February 1917. And here he falls prey to another terrible disease.
Those dastardly Germans, he gets German measles.
Which was serious then. I mean, now it's, you look pregnant, but you're not. It
might be.
But if you those days it was a nasty disease.
Yeah, he's hospitalised for about a month
in Rouen, and he writes another really good poem that shows his attitude to people behind the line. He's not anti. He's a very, that's his concentration. We mentioned it earlier. He doesn't like people behind the line, does he? And it's called Base Details.
If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the Roll of Honour, poor young chap. I'd say I used to know his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap, and when the war is done and youth stone dead, I'd toddle safely home and die in bed.
Now, I really like that poem, and I like his semi-humorous ones. I think they're more powerful for the wit, and they're pretty sharp, aren't they? Now, the next one is not. It's quite a nasty poem in some sense. He didn't like his fellow officers at Rouen visiting the local brothels, and he wrote some. Well, it's Misogynist Dog. It's doggerel. But it has got a great joke at the end of it, so we're going to allow ourselves the privilege of you.
And it's fair to say this wasn't intended for publication, was it?
This is just.
It's just a note he scribbles.
It's one off the wrist.
Right. She met me on the stairs in her chemise. I grinned and offered her a 5-franc note. Poor girl, no doubt she did her best to please, but I'd have been far happier with a goat.
Now, why is that so funny? Because, I mean, there is a humour.
Yeah, I mean, it's unpleasant, but it is funny.
Why is it funny?
Because the Royal Welsh Fusiliers had a much favoured regimental goat
Much
mascot.
favoured, Gary? What do you mean by much favoured?
Well, perhaps it was a bit too close to the truth for some.
Yeah, we shouldn't have read that. We shouldn't have enjoyed it. We did. Now, Sassoon's posted to join B Company, 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers. We've encountered them, and this is the famous battalion that Dunn wrote his memoir, which I believe I gave you a copy that was.
Yes, it's up there. You're
Perfect,
the
right size for you
Very
to read.
small print.
Yeah, good. Now, he's not with them long. In fact, he's not in the front line long at any point. But he's going up to the line in the Arras sector during the Battle of Arras. This is April. And on the way, there's an incident which triggers his most famous poem, or the most famous poem to me and you, and that's The General.
Good morning, the General said, when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and we're cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack, as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack, but he did for them both with his plan of attack.
Now, again, that's another one of my favourites by him. And also limericks are one of my favourite forms of poetry.
I didn't know you'd been to Ireland.
Excellent. He's back. He's almost immediately in action, and he's put in charge of a party of about 100 bombers, and they're sent forward in support of the Cameronians, who are about to attack the Hindenburg line on the 16th of April, 1917. And this is a quote from me, Lieutenant. Well, I'm not sure what he is at this time. Let's just call him Lieutenant Siegfried Sassoon. And this is what I'm going to say. There's quite a lot of this as well, so prepare yourself. Lock yourself in for a long walk, Gary. At 0 hour, 3 a.m., I was sitting self-consciously in the Cameronians' headquarters with a rumbling din going on overhead and my 100 men sitting on the stairs. There were 50 steps up to the outer world. A bone-chilling draft came down the stairway, and our men must have regretted our 33rd Division General's edict against the rum ration. The Cameronians' colonel and his adjutant conversed in the constrained tone of men who expected nothing but ill news. There was a large cake on the table. Now, that would have been the entire focus of your attention.
It is.
I was offered a slice. Your hope is burgeoning, which I ate with embarrassment. I wasn't feeling at all at home.
Now, the attack breaks down, and after about 3 hours, there's a messenger, and Sassoon goes on to say,
This messenger entered and proved to be a dishevelled sergeant who blurted out an incoherent statement about their having been driven back after advancing a little way. I got up, stiffly aware that my moment had arrived.
No.
Probably.
I got up stiffly, aware that my moment... You're not stiffly aware.
Oh, punctuation's so important, isn't it?
Yes.
Probably I mumbled something to the colonel, but I can't remember him giving me any instructions. I'm very conscious of punctuation now. I was, however, sensitive to the fact that both colonel and adjutant were alive to the delicacy of my situation. Their muttered message was, "Well, old chap, I suppose you're for it."
Yeah, no, he had absolutely no idea of what was going on, but he took 25 of his bombers forward, and he says,
I hadn't the slightest idea, much akin to me,
much akin to what I've just said,
what I was going to do, and my destination was in the brain of the stooping Cameronian guide who trotted in front of me. After dodging and stumbling up a narrow communication trench, we arrived at the wide main trench, and there we met the Cameronians. I must have picked up a Mills bomb on the way, for I had one in my hand when I began my conversation with their leader. I had the advantage of him since I was advancing, and he and his men were out of breath and coming away from the objective. I was told that the Germans were all round them and that they were out of bombs. Feeling myself to be, for the moment, an epitome of Royal Welsh Fusiliers prestige, I became unnaturally jaunty and unconcerned. But where are the Germans? I asked carelessly, tossing my bomb from left hand to right. I can't see any Germans.
Now, a Cameronian NCO took him in hand.
Neither of us spoke. I also was carrying a bag of bombs. We advanced and went round the next bay. I experienced a sobering shock then for a young, fair-haired Cameronian private. Or pirate. Can I borrow your new eyes?
Yes.
Was lying propped against the wall in a pool of his own blood. His open eyes were staring vacantly at the sky. His face was grey and serene. A few yards up the trench was the body of a German officer, crumpled up and still. The wounded Cameronian made me feel angry with our invisible enemies, and I slung a couple of bombs in their direction and received a reply in the form of an egg bomb, which exploded harmlessly behind me. I went on throwing bombs and advancing, while a corporal, who was obviously much more artful and efficient than I, dodged up the saps at the side. Between us, we created a considerable demonstration of offensiveness. In this manner, we reached our objective.
Now, many people say that you're a considerable demonstration of offensiveness, Pete, don't they?
Yes. I cannot tell a lie.
Now, Sassoon, he's still all at sea. He's still not got a real clue what's happening, has he, Pete?
Not from what I could see here. Here's his quote. I had no idea where our objective was, but the corporal told me we'd reached it. And he seemed to know what he was about. This, curiously enough, was the first time he spoke to me. I had caught an occasional glimpse of a retreating German, but the whole thing had been so absurdly easy that I felt like going on still farther. There was a narrow sap running out of the place where we halted. You stay where you are, I remarked to Smart, and then I started to explore the sap. What I expected to find there I can't say. Finding nothing, I paused for a minute to listen. There seemed to be a lull in the proceedings of the attack. Spasmodic machine guns rattled. High overhead there was an aeroplane. Well, I'd be surprised if it was beneath.
Now, this is where he makes what could have been a fatal mistake.
I thought, what a queer business it all was, and then decided to take a peep at the surrounding country. No sooner had I popped my head out of the sap than I received what seemed like a tremendous blow in the back between my shoulders. My first notion was that I'd been hit by a bomb from behind. What had really happened was that I'd been sniped from in front. Anyhow, my attitude towards life and the war had been instantaneously and completely altered for the worse. I leaned against the wall and shut my eyes. When I opened them again, Sergeant Baldwin was beside me, discreet and sympathetic. To my great surprise, I discovered I was not dead.
Now, he's helped back to the main trench by some of the men.
Are you husky with emotion?
I am. I'm just husky. This is my husky voice. Now, he's helped back to the trench. And what does he say when he gets there, Pete?
After about a quarter of an hour, I began to feel active and heroic again, but in a different way. I was now not only a hero, but a wounded hero. I can remember talking excitedly to a laconic Stokes mortar officer, just pictured, who had arrived from nowhere with his weapon. My only idea was to collect all our available ammunition and renew the attack. My overstrained nerves had stirred me up to such a pitch of febrile excitement that I felt capable of the most suicidal exploits. This convulsive energy might have been of some value had there been any rational outlet for it, but there was none.
Now, in the end, the action fizzled out and he's evacuated back.
So nothing happens of all this here.
No, he's a very brave man. He clearly is.
But in this particular occasion, there's no way out. He's just wounded. He goes back. And what happens when he goes back?
Well, on his return for medical treatment in England, Sassoon decides that he's had enough. and he's going to make a stand against the conduct of the war. This was on an emotional stand based on his own feelings rather than any rational, logical analysis.
And it's not about the generals. His focus is more about the politicians, about civilians, about people who weren't ending the war, who didn't have objectives.
Well, also the purpose of the war. He felt that it had changed from a defensive war to a more aggressive war. And at the end of his convalescence leave, he refuses to return to duty when he's recalled. Now, he's already a week late in July 1917 when he refuses. Now, he's being encouraged in all of this by his pacifist friends, and he sends a letter to his commanding officer, which he entitled "Finished with the War, a Soldier's Declaration." And you're going to read it, Pete.
I am. I'm making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority because I believe the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I am a soldier, convinced that I am acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defence and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. I believe that the purposes for which I and my fellow soldiers entered upon this war should have been so clearly stated as to have made it impossible to change them, and that, had this been done, the objects which actuated us would now be attainable by negotiation. I have seen and endured the suffering of the troops, and I can no longer be a party to prolong these sufferings for ends which I believe to be evil and unjust. I am not protesting against the conduct of the war, but against the political errors and insincerities for which the fighting men are being sacrificed. On behalf of those who are suffering now, I make this protest against the deception which is being practised on them. Also, I believe that I may help to destroy the callous complacence with which the majority of those at home regard the continuance of agonies which they do not share and which they have not sufficient imagination to realise. Powerful, hard-hitting stuff.
Absolutely.
Probably helped by pacifist chums in writing it, but that may be a calamity. Some of the phrasing doesn't seem quite him. But certainly the themes that he addresses in his poetry are there. Like at the end, the callous complacence, that reflects that poem about the...
It's certainly how he is feeling, if not his words. Now, it's forwarded to the press and it's read out in the House of Commons. And the letter was seen by some as near treasonous.
It is seen by some, but on the other hand, this is a very famous poet now. He's the old huntsman's done well, and also he's a young hero.
He's got an MC, hasn't he? So rather than court-martial Sassoon, the army plays the long game, and being kindly and sympathetic when he finally reports to Litherland on the 13th of July. Now they want him to take a medical board.
Why could that be?
Well, then they could class him as unfit for service and have him treated for neurasthenia, as it was then known. So, you know, he's suffering from a
shell shock.
Shell shock. Now, at first, Sassoon refuses to attend, but he's becoming frustrated, and he makes a symbolic gesture.
Oh, I know what that is. That the famous thing? Tell us about it.
Well, it's thought by some that he threw his military cross into the Mersey on Formby Beach, but it was only his ribbon. And
in fact, the description he gives makes it quite clear because he says it floated. I'm not sure medals float.
Yeah, and the MC itself was rediscovered in 2007.
Oh, well, so yeah, I remember that vaguely. His son had got it or something. It was something, I don't remember the details. Now, his friends, so some of his friends are all for what he's doing, and that's his pacifist friends.
Yeah.
They're really gung-ho for him. Some of his other friends are concerned at him being used as a battering ram and possibly what will happen to him if the army suddenly stop playing a long game and a friendly game. Who is his friend who's most concerned? And it's a good friend to him, in my view.
He's a good friend to him, and he's still alive. And it's Robert Graves. Now, he persuades him to attend the medical board, and as a result, he's sent to Craig Lockhart War Hospital.
He appears for him at the medical board, and Sassoon isn't quite pleased with what Sassoon... Basically, Robert Graves saves him from any disciplinary action by falling in with the army's plan. And Sassoon he can't maintain his line, can he?
No, but let's be honest. The army could have, as you said, taken a very, very different line. So I think Robert Graves in this case is working entirely in the interests of his friend.
I think so too, and not in the interests of pacifism and the global war.
Or Robert Graves.
I think he does a great job. And I know that when he appears at the medical board giving evidence for Sassoon, people think that, hang on, he's not that well himself. Anyway, where's he sent? And now, funnily enough, we're not doing much about this because we're doing Sassoon the soldier. But where's he sent?
He's sent to Craiglockhart War Hospital, which is near Edinburgh, and he's being officially treated for neuralgia.
Now, this is where there's so much rubbish talked about this. He's treated by Dr. W.H.R. Rivers, who's a really good psychiatrist, and what does he think of Sassoon? What does he think's wrong with Sassoon, or if anything?
Well, he has lots of long conversations where Sassoon would sort of ramble on about his favourite subject,
What's that?
Largely himself, and his emotional reactions. So he doesn't consider him as neurasthenic.
Shell-shocked. Yeah, he basically he's treated him by talking him through, and so he's also partially playing the army's game as well, sort of talking this whole thing out until Sassoon reverts to Mad Jack and wants to be at the front again.
And he should know what he's talking about because he's got 3 initials.
Yeah, that is always a good sign.
It's a very good sign.
Now, Sassoon later writes, I must never forget Rivers. He is the only man who can save me if I break down again. If I'm able to keep going, it will be through him. Notice he considers now that what happened to him was a breakdown. He doesn't maintain this anti-war... Well, he maintains the anti-war line, but he doesn't maintain the hard-line statement, the refusing to return to duty, all that, does he? He doesn't maintain it for long.
No, and rather oddly, he does think that he's had a breakdown, whereas the doctor doesn't think that he was suffering from shell shock. So that's really quite interesting.
Now who does he meet while he's there?
Well, he meets Wilfred Owen, another great war poet,
another second lieutenant.
He greatly encourages him in his poetic endeavours, and he helps Owen to refine his prodigious natural talents.
Now, this is interesting because he does. I mean, one of Owen's most famous poems is "Anthem for Doomed Youth." I find Owen is worshipped by some. His poetry is very serious, and Sassoon helps refine him. And there's a handwritten amendments to one of his to that
there is
poem.
A preserved manuscript, isn't there?
And it used to be on display at the Imperial War Museum. I've no idea whether it is or not now, because it's all changed since my day, which was decades ago now. But he does help a lot now, and he helps refine Owen's poetic talent. So what happens? It's his protest. Is it a real political thing?
No, I mean it's basically an emotional reaction, and his feelings once again have shifted, and it moves more towards a willingness to be back at the front with his men,
lads,
because he felt guilty for abandoning them.
Oh yeah, so I mean, I think he is a little bit. He's sensitive. He's a bit self-obsessed.
He's young.
But he's young, and he's not that young, but he is young.
He's young.
Yes, compared to us, he's young, and he's working through some very complex things. He's sensitive, which we're not, and
at a time of great turmoil.
It is. Now he's discharged in November 1917 from Craiglockhart, and he goes back first to Litherland. He's back in the army now. The army long game has worked, hasn't it? Let's be. It's worked. January 18, he goes to the new Royal Welsh Fusiliers Depot, New Barracks, Limerick, Ireland, and guess what he does there? Is it write revolutionary poems or take part in...
No, he immerses himself once more in hunting.
Oh, back to that, yes. But a month later, he's sent to join the 25th Montgomery and Welsh Horse Royal Welsh Fusiliers. That's what they'd been, and now they were just an infantry battalion. And they're in Egypt and Palestine for 3 months.
Now, that's a bit like the army are keeping him away out of the way.
You are such a cynic, Gary.
Moving to the sidelines.
The army would never. The army would never be so duplicitous.
Now, even the army have to realise they're needed in France in early May 1918.
Well, what's happening in the spring of 1918?
Well, they moved back to France to bolster the Western Front because there's the massive German spring offensive.
Oh, the Kaiserslautern.
However, because they're desert-trained unit now, they underwent some 9 weeks training to bring them up to speed with the new methods of warfare.
There are lots of new weapons. I mean, this is the new warfare, the all-arms battle and everything. By this time, Sassoon's been promoted to acting captain and given command of A Company, and he throws himself into his new duties. This is interesting because he's now, all protests, it's all gone. He's now back to being Mad Jack and the rest of it. Damn leave! I don't want it. I don't want to be wounded and wangle a job at home. I want the next 6 weeks and success. He means as a soldier. He's back to that.
Now, he receives at this time an advance copy of his second volume of war poetry, which was entitled Counterattacked.
That's another success,
It would prove to be a critical and commercial success. Now, it's not... he was not to be in action long with the 25th Royal Welsh Fusiliers. On the 13th of July 1918, while the battalion was in the Least Valley sector, Sassoon was wounded with a nasty grazing head wound. Now, this was from a shot.
Who fired this shot?
This was from a shot fired by a sentry who'd mistaken him for a German. It's probably his name. When he was returning from a patrol carrying his helmet in his hand, a somewhat symbolic headless chicken action, really, isn't it?
Yes.
Halt, who goes there? Siegfried. That's a German name. I'll shoot him.
Funnily enough, Graves actually warned him when he said, I know something about having a German name, and they will look at you and you'll be an anti-war. So I bet that's exactly Siegfried, bang! It's not that bad. It's a nasty wound, and this is what he said. This next quote is awful. There's no humour in it. And he says this: the chap at the casualty clearance station with his jaw blown off by a bomb. A fine-looking chap he was, they said. He lay there on the bed with one hand groping about on the bandages that covered his whole head and face, gurgling every time he breathed. His tongue was tied forward to stop him swallowing it. The war had gagged him, smashed him. Me, it had spared. People looked at him and tried to forget what they'd seen. Not expected to live. Surely he would be better dead. All this I remembered, while the desirable things of life, like living phantoms, stole quietly into my brain, looked at me wistfully and crept away again, beckoning, pointing to England in a few days. And that's a powerful quote, I think. What happens for the rest of the war?
Well, he spends the remainder of the war in Britain, because by this time he'd been promoted to acting captain. Yeah. He relinquishes his commission on health grounds on the 12th of March 1919, but he's allowed to retain the rank.
Yeah. So that's the end of his war. I remember he says about Armistice Day, he took no pleasure in it. He hated the common people celebrating it because in the end he is a bit of a snob. He has a sentimental attraction to his lads in the ranks, but he's a strange. He's of his class. He's of his time. He lives for a bit in Oxford. He visited. He doesn't do much. He dabbles a bit in politics for a while. He takes up a post as literary editor of the Daily Herald. But then he branches into prose, doesn't he, from 1928? And this is my favourite things. What does he write? He
writes Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, which it was anonymously published. It was supposed to be a fictionalised autobiography. It's immediately accepted as a classic, and it brings its author well-deserved fame as a prose writer.
It's part of...
Yeah, you mentioned it earlier. The central character is George Shurston. He's a lazy bugger.
Oh, God, please don't use language like that. This is a podcast for
He is. He's just a country gentleman, content to play cricket and go hunting foxes before war changes his life. Who does that sound like? I wonder who he based it on. Now, overall, it's a fairly humorous work, and it's very different from most of his war poems.
And there's two more, isn't it? Because it becomes the George Shurston trilogy. So what are the other two volumes?
There's Memoirs of an Infantry Officer, which is 1930, and Shurston's Progress in 1936.
Now, collectively, they're brilliant, and I'll recommend everybody to read them. They are fundamentally. He changes names of individuals, but actually, it's the same as his diaries. And then he puts out 3 volumes of real autobiography, and they are, I'll briefly gather, The Old Century, The Weald of Youth, and Siegfried's Journey. And I'll recommend all of them. I also, he's a great writer of prose. His poetry's okay, but he's a great writer of prose. He dies. He is an interesting life, but we're doing the soldier bit. It's over. He dies of stomach cancer, 1st September 1967. He's buried at St Andrew's Church at Mells in Somerset. Must have a look at that. What books do you recommend to read about him?
Well, there's Siegfried Sassoon, The Making of a War Poet, 1886 to 1918, by Jean Moorcroft Wilson.
There's Regimental Records of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, Volume 3, 1914-18, France and Flanders, by Dudley Ward.
Siegfried Sassoon by John Stewart Roberts.
And the Siegfried Sassoon Diaries, edited by Rupert Hart Davies. Well, there we go, Gary. I hope you enjoyed that.
Yeah, it's great. It's a bit of a departure for us, I thought.
Let's hope people enjoy it. Cheers, chum.
Cheers, Pete.